والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه الطاهرين ما دام ما في السماوات والأرضين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم إنا نسألك علما ينفعنا ويرفعنا. اللهم إنا نسألك علما نافعا ورزقا واسعا وعملا متقبلا وشفاء من كل داء. نوينا التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والإفادة والاستفادة والنفع والانتفاع والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وآله وصحبه وسلم. وبعد، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, we thank and praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all of His blessings that He has bestowed upon us, and we beseech Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase us in those blessings. Alhamdulillah, by His grace, we continue our reading of this all-important primer of Islamic legal theory, referred to as or titled as al-Waraqat, a few pages dealing with Islamic legal theory. In our last lesson, we had looked at the definition of Usul al-Fiqh and the fact that it is made up of two parts, two components, the one being Usul and the other one being Fiqh. Usul is a plural of the word asl, which we can translate as basis literally, and Fiqh literally means to understand, and technically it refers to the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to the actions of a person. The definition in terms of Arabic reads as Ahkamullah al-Muta'alliq bi-af'al al-Mukallafin, the address of Allah, the rules of Allah that relates to the actions of a person. Imam al-Haramain goes on in today's lesson and he gives us a breakdown in terms of those rulings. So, hukm is an address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to our actions. Depending on how that particular address relates to our actions, based on that we find that there is a division of ahkam, there's a division of the address of Allah, there's a division of the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to our actions. What are they? We look to the text now, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It says, وَالْأَحْكَامُ سَبْعَةٌ. وَالْأَحْكَامُ سَبْعَةٌ. The rules that relate to the actions of a person, these rules are divided into seven. They can be categorized into seven categories. What are those seven categories? He says, al-wajibu, number one. We're going to explain that inshallah in the next lesson bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For now, we're going to be dealing with al-ahkam. So the ahkam, the rulings are seven. Wajib, mandub, mubah, mahdhur, makruh, sahih, and batil. So the translation of this particular part of the text reads as follows: the revelatory rules are seven. There are seven in number. What are they? Number one, wajib. Number two, mandub. Number three, mubah. Number four, mahdhur. Number five, makruh. Number six, sahih. And number seven, batil. This may possibly be the first time that you are coming across these terms. So I'm going to provide a basic translation for them bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let's go again from the beginning. The revelatory rulings are seven. In other words, those rules that relate to any given action of ours, those rules, that particular address, it falls into one of seven categories. Either wajib, which means to be compulsory or mandatory if you want to. Mandub literally means recommended. Mubah, certain of our scholars translate it as religiously neutral. Mahdhur, that which is prohibited, proscribed. Makruh, that which is reprehensible. Sahih, that which is valid. And batil, that which is invalid. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So there we have the seven rulings. What the explanatory notes now does for us, and this is going to be our lesson for today basically, we're going to be looking at these seven rulings. We're going to be looking at the seven rulings and wrapping our heads around it. So we're going to be looking at it from different perspectives. So in terms of the explanatory notes, this is how these rulings are divided. So you could ask yourself the question, how do we come to seven rulings? How is it that we took the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to the actions of a morally responsible person, of a mukallaf. How did we take those rulings and subdivide it into 7 categories? How did we do that? We did that in the following manner. So, in terms of Ibn al-Firqah's explanation, he says, the actions of a morally responsible person, and that is simply a translation for the word mukallaf. In other words, a person who is aqil and baligh, a person of sound mind, and a person that has reached the age of puberty. So the actions of a morally responsible person are classified in one of 7 ways as per the Waraqat. In other words, any given action, when you look at that particular action, it falls into one of 7 categories. What are those categories? So this is the way we divide it. When you look at the action, it is either a mu'amala. What is meant by mu'amala? If you look at the word mu'amala, it comes from the root letters amila, which means to do. Amala is basically to do with another. So mu'amala is when you interact with another. You are dealing with another. So mu'amala we translate as dealings. So again to the beginning, that any given action, it is either a mu'amala, it is a dealing that you are having with another person. An example of this would be a sale. You are selling something. When you're selling something, you're selling it to somebody. You're going to be the seller, I'm going to be the buyer. You're selling it to me, it's a dealing. A person gets married, it's another form of mu'amala. It's a contract, a social contract, yes. You're getting married to a person. You cannot get married to yourself. There is a mu'amala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So again, your actions are either a mu'amala, it is a dealing. In the case when we find that our mu'amala is a dealing, then what happens? Then a ruling of either siha or butlan applies. We translate the word siha as validity, and we translate the word butlan as invalidity. So again, let us just take a step back. Any given action can fall into one of 7 categories. The first major heading would be, this is a dealing. You are dealing with another person. If you are dealing with another person, and the examples that we gave was, you selling something, you entering into a marriage contract, or even a divorce. A person doesn't divorce himself. A husband would divorce the wife, so it's a form of dealing. Those actions can be either classified as number 1. So now we're starting to deal with the categories. Number 1, it would be sahih. In other words, it is deemed to be valid. In other words, there's an address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that makes a pronouncement on that particular dealing and renders that particular dealing valid. Now, what is validity? We will discuss that at a later stage bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But for now, to understand that if you have a dealing, then there is an address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that speaks to that dealing. And it either renders it valid, sahih, or alternatively, there could be an address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that speaks to that particular action of yours and renders it as batil. This is the terminology which Imam al-Haramain uses here. Normally, within the Shafi school of thought, we would use the term fasid, but we use it interchangeably, fasid and batil. You may have come across the term batil and wondering why that particular term is not being used here. We use them synonymously, we use them interchangeably, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So there we have 2 down. We've spoken about siha, in other words validity, and also we've spoken about butlan, in other words invalidity. Now, that which you are doing may not be a mu'amala, may not be a dealing. For example, you and I, we are going to pray. So we're going to pray our asr, or we're going to pray our maghrib, or isha, or subh, or dhuhr, or we may be fasting. That particular action, it is not a dealing. Yes, you are dealing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but not a dealing with a fellow human being or another given entity. You are dealing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it is not deemed as a mu'amala. It is not deemed as a mu'amala. So if that is the case, your action is not a dealing with another, then we have the following classification. What does that classification read as? So if the action does not relate to mu'amala, then it is either a request or alternatively, what we refer to static permission. I'm going to explain that now bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let's get to the explanation. You're not a dealing, it's a prayer. So then there is an address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to that action. What does it do? In relation to it, it is either a rule of request. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is requesting that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is requesting it. so to say. Further down, we're going to make another subdivision. The request can either be to do, in other words, a commission, or it can be a request to omit, in other words, an omission. Again, let's get back. We're looking at an example. The example we have in mind is that of prayer. We find that there's an address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to it. Firstly, it's not a dealing. It's other than a dealing. In our case, it is an act of worship. So in relation to this act of worship, you can have an address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that does what? That requests either that you do it or that you omit it. Alternatively, it could simply be that there's a static permission applies. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is indifferent. As we will see later, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if it falls into the second category, in other words, you have an address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to an action of yours, which is not a dealing. For example, having lunch. So you may decide to either have chicken for lunch or you may decide to have meat for lunch. In relation to this particular action of yours, what is the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? We find that it is static. It is a static permission. In other words, it is a neutral. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is indifferent to whether you have chicken or whether you have meat. That falls into the second category. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to look to the first category. So just to refresh us, if the action does not relate to mu'amalat, then either a rule of request applies or there's a static permission that applies. So now if we look at the first one, and what is the first one? The first one is a rule of request. The action we're talking about is the action of salah. So in relation to salah, it is not a dealing. In relation to that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a request. Now this request which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has is either, and now on my left hand side, your right hand side, a request to commission something. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking you to do something. So let's keep Salatul Asr in mind. So it is not a dealing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a request regarding it. The request, if the request is to commission something, but the request in terms of its nature is peremptory, in other words, mandatory. It's not a dealing. Allah is requesting you to do it, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is requesting you to do it in a peremptory manner, in other words, in a mandatory manner. Then this rule is classified as ijab. In other words, whatever it relates to becomes wajib. So let's just look at that quickly. The example we have is Salatul Asr. It's not a dealing. We find that the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relates to it. In other words, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, aqimus salah, establish the prayer. So this address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it relates to the action of praying Maghrib. How does it relate to it? It requests you to do it. How does it request you to do it? In a preemptory manner. In other words, in a mandatory manner. If that is the case, then that particular action, the commission of that action is referred to as a wajib action, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Alternatively, you pray your Salatul Maghrib. You understand now that there was a request from Allah. That request was peremptory. It was mandatory, so you had to pray it. So you finish praying. Now afterwards, you find and you discover that there's another request from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does it relate to? It relates to the performance of 2 units of prayer after the Maghrib Salah. But then you find it is a request from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but in a non-mandatory manner. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is requesting from you, but not in a binding manner, in a non-binding manner. Then that particular issue would become mandub, and the performance of that particular action would be rendered as mandub. So how much have we covered that far? We've covered quite a bit. If we look at the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to our actions, we spoke about 2. Firstly, if it's dealings, siha and butlan, 2 down. Then we've spoken about ijab and nadb, or if you wanted to, wajib and mandub. So there we have 4 down, and now we have 3 more to go. Bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What are the balance of the 3? So what do? We look to the other side. The request, it's no longer to commit something, but the request is to omit something. There's a request to omit something. Now, when there's a request to omit something, again, the same that applies to a request to commit something applies to the request to omit something. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is requesting you not to do something, He can request you not to do something in a peremptory manner, in other words, in a mandatory manner. For example, Allah tells you, and one of the famous examples would be, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا, do not come near to adultery or fornication. So that's a request from Allah, not for commission, but rather for omission. And how is Allah making this particular request? Allah is making this request in a mandatory manner. If that's the case, then this is classified as hadar, or if you wanted to mahdur. If you wanted to, terms that you are maybe more familiar with, it is hurma or tahrim, and the action would become a haram action. Alternatively, as you can see on the slide, if this request comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for you not to do something, for example, a person goes to relieve himself, and excuse me for this particular example, a person goes to the lavatory to relieve himself. So now standing and urinating. So we find that there is a request from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to omit this action, in other words, not to stand. But we find that this particular request is not in a mandatory manner, but rather in a recommended manner if you want to. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying to you, it's better for you not to stand. In other words, if you sit, I'm going to reward you. However, if you stand, I'm not going to punish you for it. So if we find that the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relates to the action in this particular manner, then we're going to refer to that address as karaha, and we're going to refer to the action as makruh. So how much have we covered now? We've covered 6. We've looked at the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It either relates to a dealing. If it relates to a dealing, then it's either sihha or it is fasad. If it relates to a non-dealing, then either it is a request, and the request is to commit in a preemptory manner or in a non-preemptory manner. So there we have 2 plus we have another 2, that would basically be 4. Then on the other hand, the last one which we discussed now was there's a request to omit something, and that also happens either in a mandatory manner or a non-mandatory manner. So there we come to 6 altogether. 1 remains. And the one that remains basically is what we discussed at the beginning, and that would be basically the second category, and that is the category of religious neutrality, and that is referred to in Arabic as mubah, and we turn to that now bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the second category in our initial division, when we spoke right at the beginning, we spoke about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a non-dealing issue. Then either Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes a request or there's a static permission. In other words, there's no tarjih. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is indifferent. He doesn't give preference to its omission or its commission. And that particular type of address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we refer to it as ibaha, and the action that it relates to would be considered as mubah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We now continue bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we look at certain other divisions. So the takeaway for this part of the class now would be, look, how many laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are there? How many rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are there? Or alternatively, if you wanted to, how many types of address does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have that relates to our actions? So what did we say? According to Imam al-Haramain, he says that there are 7. Now it's good to discuss alternate views, though this is a beginner book, and it is a primer. It is good to understand alternate views simply because understanding the alternate view many times assists us in understanding our current view. So let's look to certain alternate views in this particular regard. There's one view, the first view that we're going to discuss. Don't worry, it's not going to add, it decreases. It says, look, there are not 7 rulings, addresses, no, but rather there are only 5. So what happens in those particular 5? Which ones are excluded? We look to that part of the explanation now, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What does it say? It reads as, so other views regarding the amount of ahkam, there is a view that the rulings are 5. But this particular rule does not exclude sahih and batil. So in other words, if you look on the face of it, we're going to have 5 rules. What are they going to be? Wajib, mandub, mubah, makruh, and haram. They're going to be 5. So you're saying now, but sihha and fasad are excluded. Apparently it is excluded, but in real terms it's not, because sihha and fasad respectively are now subcategorized under one of the 5. So where do they fall beneath? The author says, in this view, sahih dealings fall under the category of mubah, while batil falls under mahdhur. So when we look at a valid dealing, then that particular valid dealing in our first division, when there was 7, we would give it an independent ruling. But here we don't give it an independent ruling. We still consider it, but we say it falls under that which is permitted. In other words, that which is religiously neutral. And if it is invalid, a dealing which is invalid, you sell a car and you don't determine the price for the car. So that particular transaction is referred to as batil. The address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to it is batil, but you don't have a category called batil. Where does it fall under if you only consider it to be 5? It falls under the category of mahdhur, in other words, under haram, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. As you will come to gain a better understanding of Islamic legal theory, you will understand that particular division isn't the best of divisions, because there's a distinct difference between certain contracts that are proscribed, in other words haram, and there are others which may very well be valid. It's valid in and of itself, but it's still considered to be haram. So it's a bit difficult, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, at least on the face of it, to create batil as a subcategory of haram. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We continue with our reading bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's another view that increases the rulings to 9. There is another view which increases the rulings to 9, adding rukhsa and azima. I said here in this particular slide, in terms of preparation, let's count them again. And I think it's good, at-takrar yu'allimu al-himar, that repetition is good. That's how I translated and understand the gist of that particular issue. So we had 7. What were the 7? They're very easy. It is either wajib, or it is mandub, mubah, makruh, or haram. That's 5. Then what do we add to that? Sihha and fasad. So it becomes 7. So there's another view which says there are 9. How do we get to 9? We add 2 others. What are the 2 others that we add? I think it's very important to understand this as well. It is an azima, which we will define in a moment, bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the other one is a rukhsa, So they are very interesting to understand, because an azima, from my understanding, is that what is an azima? If you construct it and construe it as an address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to one of your actions, then it's simple to understand, as well as rukhsa. Rukhsa is also an address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to some of our actions. So let's look at that bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's turn to what is a rukhsa. So the scholars say rukhsa refers to a permitted action whilst the proof prohibiting it still stands. Let's read through that again. Rukhsa refers to a permitted action. In other words, the action that you are going to be doing. We're going to give a few examples now, but just think about it theoretically. Inshallah, the examples will make it abundantly clear, but let's look at the theory for now. It is a permitted action, so there's no question about it being permitted. However, while the proof prohibiting it still stands, despite the fact that what you are doing is permissible, there is a proof. The proof that prohibits it still stands. That is basically what a rukhsa is. That's basically what a rukhsa is. So let's look at examples in order to clarify that bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And here, gratefully, we have a number of examples. So the first example would be the permissibility of eating carrion in life-threatening circumstances, whilst the proof prohibiting the same still stands. So this is a nice example for us to look to. Is it permissible for a person to eat carrion? No, it's not permissible. What is the proof? The proof is very clear in terms of Quran and the way of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that clearly and somewhat categorically prohibits us from consuming carrion. Anything which has not been slaughtered in the manner that it is supposed to be slaughtered. An animal dies of natural causes. You come across the carcass. Can you cut up the carcass and consume it? No, you can't. That is carrion. However, if you find yourself in a life-threatening circumstances, you have no access to food, but that it is permissible. So, whilst the proof that prohibits the consummation, or the consuming rather, not consummation, the consuming of carrion, that still stands. But because of your circumstances, you are allowed to consume it. You're consuming it despite the standing prohibition, that particular address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that makes that what was otherwise impermissible permissible. That is referred to as a rukhsa, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Let's look at another example. Example number 2. Likewise, a more palatable example if you wanted to. Likewise, wiping over leather socks is a rukhsa, since the proof obligating the washing of the feet still stands. This is a relatively easier one to explain. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say in the Holy Quran? فَاغْسِلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ. Allah says that you must wash your feet. So the proof making washing your feet compulsory. So look at washing your feet, think about it as an action. So what do we find? We find that there's an address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that does what? That relates to the action of washing your feet in the course of wudu. And what does it do to it? It makes it compulsory. So this still stands. However, at the same time, we know that despite the fact that this rule still stands, we find that there is a concession. And that concession says that if you are wearing leather socks, then as opposed to washing your feet, you can wipe your feet. So now that action of wiping your feet, how do we term that? We term that as a rukhsa, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. We look to another example, and the last example, and also again a very interesting example, and that particular interesting example says that similarly making istinja with stones and toilet paper are dispensation, as the proof mandating the removal of najasa with water still stands. This is a very interesting one, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So you need to remove the corporeal in terms of the impurity, and you need to remove all traces. How is that achieved? Through water. So there's proof that mandates that. However, we find that dispensation has been made, that despite the fact that you may find water, despite the fact that you may find water, it is allowed. There's a concession that you can use toilet paper or any other solid substance which is not necessarily going to remove all of the traces of your impurity, but only going to remove the corporeal. You are allowed to do that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So now we understand what rukhsa means. What is azima on the other hand? We turn to the text once again. Now the reason why we are discussing this is because certain scholars, they say no, there's not 5. There are 7 rulings like Imam al-Haramain. Others say no, it's not only 7, there are 9. And what do? They add rukhsa, which we have explained now, a concession if you wanted to. But now we want to know what is an azima. So the text now deals with azima. This is in light of Ibn al-Firkah's explanation of this particular part of the text. What does he say? Azima, on the other hand, refers to the address of Allah that makes prayer and fasting by way of example compulsory without it being opposed. So, for example, what happens now, and probably the best example to use would be the prayer, because there's no circumstances where the prayer falls away. So, prayer is classified as an azima. What is an azima? What is an azima? It is the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that makes something compulsory, that you need to do this. Whilst there is no proof, there's no concession relating to it. That is basically what an azima is. So an azima would be that which you must do, and there is no concession for you in that particular regard. For example, prayer. There's no circumstances wherein prayer falls away, and we would refer to that as the azima, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Now we look to certain alternate definitions of the concept of azima in order just to give us a better understanding of this particular concept. So certain scholars have defined azima as an established ruling. Now in Arabic that would be al-hukmu thabit, the established ruling. And I like this particular definition because it makes things abundantly clear. So certain scholars have defined azima, this is a particular address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to our actions. So what is it? It is an established rule, khulifa li'udhrin, that has been contradicted, and that would be for a valid reason. So in the examples that we did, we have a standard rule. What is it? You must wash your feet. It's a standing rule. It is established by the Quran. But then that particular standing rule has been contradicted for a valid reason by providing concession, whereby when you're wearing a leather sock, you can now wipe over it. So the original standing rule that is contradicted by a concession, that original standing rule is referred to as an azima. So what do we learn from here also is we learn that rukhsa would then be a ruling that contradicts an established one for a valid reason. So if azima is the ruling that is being contradicted, then rukhsa is that which contradicts the established rule, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So in terms of our slide, we come to the conclusion that rukhsa is therefore always juxtaposed to an azima. They work in tandem. In other words, the above definition creates the symbiosis between the rukhsa and the azima, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So we basically want to round up this particular idea, and for me, rounding up the discussion of rukhsa and azima is facilitated by the following. So for further clarification, number one, and also to round things up, the following definition beautifully rounds up this discussion. What does it say as regards to an azima? What is an azima? What type of address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is this that relates to our action? Hukmun ghayra min su'ubatin ila suhulatin. It is a ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let's just think about washing the feet. So that is a ruling, an established ruling. Ghayra, which is changed. نعم من صعوبة إلى سهولة. نعم from difficulty to ease. Why? لعذر, because of a valid reason. And this is the reason which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has established, and in many instances it's simply to make things easy, to facilitate for ease. مع قيام سبب الحكم الأصلي, whilst the cause of the original ruling still stands. And for our mutual benefit, I have reproduced the translation of this particular definition. This definition of azima, it says, a ruling that has changed from difficulty to ease for a reason, whilst the cause of the original ruling still stands. While the cause for the original ruling still stands, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. The next question that you might ask yourself would be that we understand the significance of a rukhsa, and we understand the significance of an azima. Why has Imam al-Haramain not mentioned the rukhsa and the azima? Why has he limited himself to 7 and not made it 9, as certain of the other scholars suggest, by including the rukhsa and the azima? There's a plausible explanation for this, and the explanation reads as follows. So the heading, why has Imam al-Haramain omitted azima and rukhsa? Simply because azima falls under wajib, while rukhsa at times falls under wajib, like eating carrion, for example, for a person on the verge of starvation. And at times, it falls under mubah. Rukhsa falls under mubah, like wiping on leather socks and making istinja with solid substances. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So alhamdulillah, that brings us to an end to today's lesson. Basically what we've covered was looking at the ahkam, looking at the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that relates to our actions. Into how much categories can we put them? Imam al-Haramain says 7. Some other scholars said no, they are 5, and certain other scholars have increased it to 9. So that's the basic objective of this particular class, and also to give you, we haven't really looked in detail at exactly what wajib is, neither mandub or mubah or makruh or haram. We haven't looked at into that. But what Imam Haramain has not mentioned in terms of rukhsa and azima, to a certain degree we have looked into what those definitions are and gained a better understanding overall in terms of how the address of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relates to our actions. So alhamdulillah, we thank and praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for facilitating for this all important lesson, and we pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants us understanding. Barakallahu feekum jami'an. Till we meet again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.